Turned out Scotland weren't going to be world champions as they returned home in disgrace from Argentina in 1978. That didn't mean they were through with the competition. They embarked on a 5-tournament stretch of always making the World Cup. This is the rampant misfortune of Scotland in the 1980s and at Italia 90. I have delivered the first 2 editions of my new magazine, aptly called the FALSE9 Magazine. Naturally, we have launched this with a bumper World Cup special, which you can get as a bundle or separately. Laugh at my predictions for this summer or lock into the history of the World Cup. The tumult of 1978 did not let up when Scotland was drawn with Portugal, Austria and Belgium for the newly expanded 8-team European Championships. Their participation at those games was all but over after losses in Vienna and Lisbon by the end of the year. Jock Stein was now the man in charge, plucked from Leeds United after 44 days to take over the rambunctious failure of Ali McLeod. It was hoped that his vast experience and legendary status from Parkhead would keep the national side relevant. Their continued presence in the World Cup during the 70s helped Scotland to be seeded for the also expanded 1982 World Cup, now 24 teams. Still, it could have been an easier draw when Sweden and Portugal, as well as the local rivalry of Northern Ireland, was pulled out of the hat. In a year that began with a 4-1 pacing of Portugal at Hampden in the previous Euros qualifying campaign, Scotland kept a lower profile in the opening stage of the World Cup qualifying, sneaking past Sweden and Israel 1-0 away from home, whilst also keeping a clean sheet in a Hampden stalemate with Portugal. Into the spring of 81 the campaign continued, with a handy point at home to Northern Ireland before a glut of absentees marked the visit of Israel to Glasgow. Thankfully, John Robertson was on hand with a brace in a 3-1 win. He'd become crucial, especially in the face of Archie Gemmell's decaying international career, and he got the goal, which added the gloss against Sweden on the other side of the summer and by now the sham that was the home championship. It left a point necessary at Windsor Park to confirm qualification for Scotland. A stalemate ensued, both sides would be appearing in Spain the following year. Despite being placed into the first pot of qualifying, Scotland were into Pot B for the final tournament. They'd avoided improved Belgium or France therefore, but be guaranteed a strong Central or Eastern European outfit from Pot A. In the end, that was the Soviet Union, as well as the contrasting teams of Brazil and New Zealand. Stein lamented the draw, stating, "We couldn't have got a more difficult draw. Brazil and Russia are good enough to make the final itself." And in FIFA's infinite wisdom, this 24-team World Cup would be the only one not to allow third-place teams through to the next round. The manager made Scotland's preparations deliberately tough as they played in Valencia in February and hosted the Netherlands at Hampden before the home championship, where only 1 win was achieved. The team had a Liverpool and Ipswich core at its heart, with Stein identifying John Walk as the expected talisman, especially after his blistering form in the UEFA Cup the prior year. And that's before we get on to the stylish Alan Hansen behind him, Graham Souness alongside him, and the talismanic Kenny Dalglish ahead of him. As well as that, Liverpool triumvirate, Forest's Frank Gray and John Robertson, as well as Alan Evans, made Scotland the most prolific 22 at the tournament in respect of European Cup trophies. One man who wouldn't be boarding the plane though was Andy Gray, who brutally missed the cut once again, with Joe Jordan and Steve Archibald preferred. Jock Stein though attempted to cover every base, which included actually giving the team's base a second thought, unlike his predecessor. With a better equipped accommodation, Stein also went to the unimaginable lengths of actually scouting his opposition too, something which wasn't in McLeod's arsenal, and that included a long-haul flight to New Zealand as the threat of British withdrawal was blown under the carpet amid the Falklands War.
Steve Sumner and his men had been walked. Goal number 4 from an expertly...
For the third World Cup in succession, Scotland had got a win under their belts, and this time they had achieved it early. Not since a 1976 friendly with Finland had a Scottish side netted more than 4 goals in a single game. Whilst 5 were scored, the 2 goals shipped rankled with Stein. Brazil were next as Scotland moved from Malaga to the stuffier Seville. The Seleção had been forced to come back late on in the game against the Soviets, which meant Scotland topped the group entering the match. A 1974 repeat of their draw would be ideal, considering the goal difference they had tottered up and considering that Brazil had lost just 2 of 30 games under coach Eli Santana.
Under United's David Neri gave him a chance, along with Oil. 3 minutes into the second half. In the end,
The game began magically with David Neary's thunderous effort that was unbelievably described as a toe poke by pundit Jimmy Hill. Nonetheless, despite the 4-1 defeat they suffered against what was viewed as the top side in the tournament, the Soviets couldn't improve on Scotland's 3-goal win over New Zealand. Because of the rate of goals Scotland had achieved, it meant that they wouldn't need to repeat heroics from 1978. A simple win was required to dredge themselves from third to second. After cutting a lone figure up top, Archibald received much needed help in a strike partner when Joe Jordan was added to what was now a 4-4-2, as goalkeeper Alan Rough was saved from the bench by assistant Jim McLean, who talked Steen out of the change. The Soviets lost just once in 20 games to Brazil. That was the task now faced with Scotland.
Asa Hartford. Jordan had a goalkeeper Alan Rough by surprise. The first round proved to be the limit.
For the third game in a row, things started marvellously for Scotland, who moved back to the comparatively breezy Malaga. Unfortunately though, an equaliser on the hour and a sucker punch late on cost them. Debate after the game raged around the defensive partnership of Willie Miller and Alan Hansen, statistically the two best centre-halves Scotland possessed, but not used playing with one another, as the Aberdeen partnership Miller had at club level with Alex McLeish, who was left on the bench. Scotland were out yet again by goal difference as Jock Stein had to field rumours about his future, having parried away New York Cosmos before the tournament, and now Motherwell were allegedly in for him. He would take the team into qualifying for Mexico '86. Qualification for Euro 1984 had been surprisingly scuppered by Switzerland either side of the new year thanks to a miserable 2-0 defeat in Bern and a draw back at Hampden in March. The remainder of the cycle limped along, as did the home championship, which belatedly ceased in '84. Scotland began preparations for the World Cup with a thrashing of Yugoslavia, netting 6 of the best at Hampden a month before the qualification period began, with a pair of home matches against Iceland and Spain. The first result, a gimme, a 3-0 win completed by a Paul McStay brace. The second, much more notable, as Mo Johnston laid down his marker for a position up top, with 2 goals against the Euros finalist Spain in a 3-1 win, with the other goal coming from Kenny Dalglish, who equalled Dennis Law's record of 30 international goals. Whilst the beginning of 1985 saw 0 goals and 2 seemingly damaging 1-0 defeats to Spain and Wales, the crucial game came at the end of the year with a tricky trip to Iceland. Jim Beck grabbed the only goal of the game in a contest the Scots were simply happy to get out of with the 2 points. It meant that Scotland would need a win at Ninian Park and a low-scoring Spanish win against Iceland 15 days later to progress. However, thanks to Scotland's goal difference and a point in Cardiff, it would be enough for the safety net of a playoff with Australia. Another away day with Wales, actually away this time, and another late penalty, but the night of September 10th, 1985 wouldn't be remembered for another Scotland smash and grab against the Welsh. It was the night Jock Stein passed away, succumbing to a heart attack at the end of the game. With just 2 months until the all-important first leg of the Australia playoff, Scotland had lost perhaps its greatest ever manager and now had to regroup. His assistant stepped into the breach. Stein had always surrounded himself with successful club managers, and this time it was no different. Enter Aberdeen's Alex Ferguson. After a stuttering 0-0 draw against East Germany in a friendly, Scotland waited with bated breath for the visit of the Socceroos. One from Davy Cooper and another from Frank McAvenny, and Scotland had built up a sizable lead to take to Melbourne a couple of weeks later. A stalemate suited Ferguson to the ground as Scotland confirmed their spot at a 4th consecutive World Cup. That trip would be the end of Mo Johnston's World Cup dream, at least for this summer, as his off-field antics barred him from a place on the plane to Mexico. For a team that only managed 8 goals in qualification and continued to be profligate, not selecting your informed striker was a sticking point before the team even took to Mexico. But he would barely scrape into the top 3 talking points when it came to team selection. Alan Hansen pulled out of the squad in advance of the competition, which, like Johnston, barred his entry onto the plane in Ferguson's eyes. With Alex McLeish waiting in the wings to partner clubmate Willie Miller, there could now be no excuses for defensive mix-ups, even if Scotland had lost their most decorated defender. Then there was Kenny Dalglish, who withdrew himself, needing an operation after confirming Liverpool's first ever League and FA Cup double. Not an automatic selection in '82, he had come off a season as player-manager at Anfield, so his exclusion was a hot topic by reputation only. Perhaps more illuminating should have been the selections of Steve Archibald and Paul Sturrock, who hadn't scored for Scotland for 4 years, over Ali McCoist, top scorer in Scotland with 28 goals. In being drawn Denmark, West Germany and Uruguay, Scotland had been drawn perhaps an even worse group than in '82. Whilst Denmark were debutants, they had long been a dark horse in European football, especially after their Euro '84 semi-final. West Germany, it should go without saying, were always dangerous, and Uruguay were Copa America champions and led by the talismanic Enzo Francescoli. Still, the format allowed the knockout stages for 4 of the 6 third-place teams to qualify.
He'll run up them all right. Elkiar again is making the run, edge of the area. This is dangerous. Oh, Elkiar's still in, and Elkiar!
This time Scotland would not start with a win as they had done in 1974 or in 1982. However, they had just met the best team they were likely to face in the group and had reduced them to just a 1-goal victory thanks to Preben Elkiar's goal. Up front in a 4-4-2, Paul Sturrock looked lost. The team never truly got going or showed any signs of fight. Frank McAvenny, who had been a revelation with West Ham the prior domestic campaign, would be reduced to 30 minutes off the bench both against Denmark and against Germany too. In an attempt to pack out the midfield against Franz Beckenbauer's West Germany, Ferguson lent on Steve Archibald to lead the line with an experienced trio of Gordon Strachan, Graham Souness and Steve Nicol, supplemented by Roy Aitken and Eamon Bannon, and it almost worked too.
Here's Strachan! Oh, great goal! And shrugs off one challenge. There goes Alofs! And Voller! Litbarski now for Voller. Voller turns against Neri. And there's a chance, an easy one!
Gordon Strachan grabbed the goal for Scotland early on, but it proved too early in Querétaro as Rudi Voller equalised instantly, and on the other side of half-time, Klaus Allofs struck a winner for the Germans, just as he had rescued a point in their opener. For Scotland, a brutally unlucky defeat as they became the only side to lose a game inside 90 minutes at the Mexico '86 World Cup after taking the lead. Normally they'd be out with a game to spare, but this format afforded them another opportunity. 2 points would be enough to reach the knockout stage, and therefore a win would see them through against what was, on paper at least, the weaker of the opponents in Uruguay, who had so far shown themselves up to be nothing short of brutish. The game was doomed before the match got on the bumpy turf at the Stadio Neza 86 in an unpronounceable city. Ferguson had dropped captain Graham Souness from the squad, whilst Frank McAvenny was left out altogether. Therefore, it meant a start for Graham Sharp, with the profligate Paul Sturrock joining him up top in a reversion for a 4-4-2. It didn't take long for this match to burst into life.
Victory in the final group match against Uruguay would have ensured a place in the second phase. They were reduced to 10 men. The French referee Joël Quignou ordered off Batista.
Deep run there by Roy Aitken. What's the turn going to be like? It's almost over. Brilliantly saved by...
The earliest red card in World Cup history is unlikely to ever be topped as Jose Batista clattered into Gordon Strachan. Under this intense heat at altitude, Scotland ought to have been able to capitalise. Naturally they didn't. Charlie Nicholas and David Cooper were thrown on with 20 minutes to go, but the goal never looked like coming. Ferguson resigned immediately. In what was Scotland's best chance at qualifying from a World Cup group stage, they had paced it up against the wall thanks to their own team selection issues and a failure to go for the kill when the opportunity presented itself. By the time Scotland recorded a win in another calamitous European Championship qualifying campaign, Alex Ferguson had already got his next job, that of Manchester United manager. History has failed to record how he did at Old Trafford. The SFA went in a completely new direction when hiring their next manager, Andy Roxburgh, the organisation's first director of coaching after the big names of Billy McNeil, Jock Wallace and Jim McLean had been rumoured. Apologies for the England comparison, but he was the equivalent to Gareth Southgate north of the border. Roxburgh had been responsible for Scotland's underage team since the 1970s and had an atypically glorious track record. At the 1978 Under-18s Euros, he took Scotland to only a 5th semi-final after keeping clean sheets against a trio of Portugal, Italy and West Germany. They unfortunately bowed out on penalties to Yugoslavia. 4 years later, a squad featuring Paul McStay, Gary Mackay and Pat Nevin went one better. They reached the final after a positive result against the Dutch before beating Poland and Czechoslovakia in the knockouts. The following year, having gained a qualification into the World Youth Championship, Scotland made a better fist of an international tournament in Mexico when they topped a group containing the host. The team containing Brian Gunn, Steve Clark and Brian McClare, as well as the aforementioned 3 heroes from the preceding summer, were all present. Unfortunately, they'd be undone by Poland in the quarter-finals in the Azteca. Roxburgh, though, had been able to turn the mood around somewhat in the latter months of '87 when they picked apart Belgium at Hampden in October before grabbing a late winner in Sofia to help Ireland into their first major tournament. By the time the World Cup qualification came around and the challenges of Norway, Yugoslavia, Cyprus and France, Scotland had won just 4 of 16 matches, which included pitiful draws to Luxembourg, Saudi Arabia and Malta. Beginning the campaign in Oslo, a win was of paramount importance and Mo Johnston's goal sealed it. A month later, he scored the goal at home to a deceptively strong Yugoslavian side that would soon be populated with winners of the '87 World Youth Championships. The beginning of 1989 continued to bear fruit, Mo Johnston scoring 4 goals across 3 games, all won. The double achieved over Cyprus with the much sweeter feeling of a 2-0 win over France at Hampden. But this France were a far cry from the ilk of Platini, Tigana and Le Carré Magique of the earlier part of the '80s, so when Scotland succumbed to 6 goals and defeats in Zagreb and Paris in the autumn of '89, they knew that they only needed 1 more point on the final day. That final day was a visit of Norway to Glasgow. This time it was the other half of the successful attacking partnership to flourish as Ali McCoist grabbed the goal that sent Scotland to Italy. He really did. Scotland were shipping goals at an alarming rate, 3 more against Egypt at Protodre in preparation for the tournament, but they were deadly from set pieces and they had defeated Argentina at Hampden in March. However, this format paired off with the most favourable draw they'd had yet, gave the Tartan Army life as they headed to Genoa that June. With the top 3 likely to progress, Scotland had been thrown the debutants Costa Rica after a generation of groups of death. Sweden were not what they were in the 50s or 70s, and even Brazil after the reign of Tele Santana weren't their absolute best. Roxburgh had tinkered with a sweeper system and he would continue with it against the debutants at the Stadio Luigi Ferraris. In goal, Jim Leighton again, only this time he had been stripped of all confidence after being dropped between FA Cup final ties by Man United manager Alex Ferguson. In front of him a settled defence, 3 of which were present in Mexico: Richard Goth, Alex McLeish and Roy Aitken. Meanwhile, the enigmatic Paul McStay was joined by recent debutant Stuart McCall as well as Jim Bett in midfield. But the man partner in the informed Mo Johnston was not Ali McCoist, but instead Bayern Munich frontman Alan McInally. Despite McCoy's partnership with Johnston for club and country, despite Gordon Jury's form for Chelsea, McInally was arguably the last choice forward fans wanted to see. Much like the away kit, this match had fallen into infamy as the plucky and unknown Costa Rican snatched a 1-0 win Genoa to blow up Group C wide open at Italia 90. Ali McCoist's introduction with 16 minutes to play was far too late. Brazil had looked good in their opener in Turin too, with Sweden barely laying a glove on them. That was about the only reason for optimism as the Swedes travelled down to Genoa for the second match. Wholesale changes were made, Craig Levein at the back as Jim Bett's international career in midfield was over, Murdo McLeod replacing him. The front line was much changed too, Johnston taking his place whilst both Gordon Jury and Robert Fleck replaced him. This time Ali McCoist would get just the 6 minutes.
McPherson gets a touch.
He's got it! Midfield is a problem for them now. In jumps Stromberg.
For the first time in 8 years, there was a World Cup win for Scotland to celebrate, and it was just so Scottish, wasn't it, to lose against the Minnows only to turn it on against a seemingly bigger nation in Sweden. With Brazil stuttering to another 1-goal win against the Costa Ricans and Sweden remaining favourites against the CONCACAF outfit, the group was delicately poised as the Tartan Army moved to the Stadio delle Alpi in Turin. A point would be enough for qualification, potentially even second place. Belatedly, Ali McCoist would get his starting berth alongside Johnston as Roy Aitken moved back one into the sweeper position. Paul McStay returned to the midfield too as Stuart McKimmie replaced the injured Levein in defence. This Brazil was here for the taking. 9 minutes, that's how long Scotland were from a spot in the knockout stages. Then Jim Leighton flubbed the glavering of a relatively tame effort, allowing Muller to ghost in and knock home the rebound. Third place with 2 points and a -1 goal difference was not enough when it would have been 4 years prior. In fact, Scotland finished dead last in the third place rankings when they would have occupied third in 1986 had they achieved the same tally. We're rattling through this World Cup now, almost at the end of the group stages. We've got a lot more to come, which includes plenty of international videos, so check out this playlist.